T was a bright and crisp morning as Flight 274 departed from Atlanta, headed to Washington, D.C. The sun shone through the airplane windows, casting a warm glow on the faces of the passengers settling into their seats. Among them was a black woman named Jasmine, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that signified her important role as a senator. With her laptop open on the tray table and a stack of documents beside her, she focused intently on preparing for the legislative session that awaited her in the nation's capital. As the plane ascended, the cabin buzzed with the soft sounds of conversation and the occasional laughter. Most passengers were engrossed in their own worlds, some scrolling through their phones, while others exchanged pleasantries. The atmosphere was relaxed, a stark contrast to what would soon unfold. Jasmine had just begun to review her notes for an upcoming discussion on racial equality when she overheard a couple of passengers behind her whispering. They were discussing the flight, oblivious to the calm tension that would soon envelop them all. Jasmine took a deep breath, reminding herself that this trip was not just a routine flight but a mission to advocate for those who often felt voiceless. Suddenly, the gentle hum of the aircraft was disrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. The cabin door swung open, and a police officer, Officer Daniels, stepped into the aisle. His face was flushed with anger, a stark contrast to the serene environment of the plane. His presence immediately caught the attention of the passengers, who exchanged glances, sensing that something was amiss. With a determined stride, Officer Daniels made his way down the aisle, his eyes locked onto Jasmine. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable as the whispers turned into murmurs of confusion. What could have prompted a police officer to board a commercial flight with such urgency? "Ma'am, stand up," he barked, his voice booming throughout the cabin. Jasmine's heart raced as she looked up, bewildered. The suddenness of his command left her momentarily speechless. "You are being arrested," he continued, his tone dripping with authority and disdain. Gasps filled the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes wide with shock. Jasmine's mind raced. What could this possibly be about? She slowly rose to her feet, maintaining her composure, even as her heart raced. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I haven't done anything wrong," she replied, her voice steady yet laced with confusion. The officer's expression hardened, and he moved closer, almost towering over her. "I don't have time for games. You fit the description of a suspect. Now step away from your seat." As she stood there, bewildered and affronted, Jasmine noticed a fellow passenger, a black man sitting several rows back, watching intently. His eyes were wide, reflecting a mix of shock and disbelief. She felt an unspoken connection, a shared understanding of the gravity of the situation, as if he, too, recognized the underlying tension that bubbled beneath the surface of this encounter. "Excuse me," Jasmine interjected, her voice growing more assertive. "I am a senator, and I demand to know why I'm being treated this way." The officer's demeanor faltered for a moment, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Before he could respond, murmurs of concern erupted from the other passengers. "This is outrageous," someone called out. "You can't just arrest someone without cause," another voice chimed in. "What's going on here?" The cacophony of voices rose, creating a wave of resistance against the officer's unwarranted aggression. The cabin, once filled with the sound of calm conversations, was now a storm of anxiety and outrage. The tension was electric, and Jasmine stood at the center of it all, a symbol of strength in the face of unjust authority. As Officer Daniels struggled to regain control of the situation, Jasmine's mind raced. This was not just about her, it was about every individual who had ever faced discrimination or injustice. She was determined to stand her ground, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced. The scene set the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of authority, identity, and the resilience of the human spirit. Little did Officer Daniels know that the woman he had chosen to target was more than just a senator. She was a force to be reckoned with, ready to fight against the tides of injustice that threatened to consume her. The flight continued to ascend into the clear blue sky, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension, anticipation, and the promise of a battle for justice. What was supposed to be a calm flight had transformed into a defining moment, a flashpoint for a discussion about race, power, and the importance of standing up against tyranny. As the aircraft soared higher, the tension inside the cabin thickened, creating an almost palpable energy. The whispers of confusion among the passengers grew louder, blending with the low hum of the engines. Jasmine stood at the aisle, facing Officer Daniels, who remained unyielding, his expression a mixture of determination and anger. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty churning in her stomach. "You can't just arrest someone without a valid reason." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering to the growing crowd of onlookers. The passengers, now fully engaged, were united in their disbelief at the unfolding drama. Several pulled out their phones, recording the scene as it escalated. They were witnesses to what they sensed was an injustice, and the weight of their collective gaze bore down on the officer. "Ma'am," he snapped, attempting to regain authority. "You're causing a disturbance, and I'm here to uphold the law. You fit the description of a suspect in a criminal investigation." "Suspect?" "I'm a senator," Jasmine replied, her voice rising above the murmurs of disbelief. "You have no right to treat me like this. Where is your proof? Where is the evidence?" The officer's jaw clenched as he hesitated, clearly taken aback by her assertion. Jasmine's confidence, fueled by the supportive looks from her fellow passengers, gave her the courage to stand her ground. She felt the weight of their collective scrutiny. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced unjust treatment. "Listen, I don't have time for this," Officer Daniels said, his frustration evident. "If you don't comply, I will have to escalate this further. Now, step away from your seat." Escalated how Jasmine challenged, not backing down. "You're about to make a mistake that could ruin your career." The officer's face darkened, and the atmosphere shifted. The passengers, who had initially watched in silence, now began to voice their opinions. "You can't do this," shouted a middle-aged woman sitting near the front. "Let her go." "Exactly," chimed in another passenger, a young man with a determined look. "She deserves respect, just like everyone else on this plane." With every word spoken, the unity among the passengers solidified. Jasmine felt a surge of strength as she realized she wasn't alone. The collective outrage against the officer's actions grew louder, filling the cabin with a chorus of dissent. "Why are you treating her this way?" another voice called out. "What has she done to deserve this?" Officer Daniels looked around, clearly rattled by the mounting pressure. For the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation and the potential fallout of his actions. He shifted his stance, glancing nervously at the cabin crew who were now stepping forward, alerted by the commotion. One of the flight attendants, a tall woman with a calm demeanor, approached the scene. "Officer, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, her voice soothing yet authoritative. "This woman is being uncooperative," Daniels replied, desperation creeping into his tone. "She fits the description of a suspect." The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, scrutinizing both the officer and Jasmine. "Is that so? And may I ask what that description is?" The officer hesitated, his bravado fading. I can't disclose that information," he stammered, realizing the weakness of his position. Jasmine seized the opportunity. "I demand to see that description." "You can't just arbitrarily decide to detain someone without proper justification. This isn't how law enforcement should operate." The cabin buzzed with agreement as passengers nodded in solidarity. The tension had shifted. The tide was turning against Officer Daniels. The flight attendant, sensing the escalating situation, glanced at Jasmine and then at the officer, her expression firm. "Let's de-escalate this," she suggested, maintaining her composure. "We need to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Perhaps you should step outside and discuss this with the captain." Officer Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but Jasmine spoke over him. "Yes, please do. This is a misuse of authority, and it needs to be addressed immediately." Reluctantly, the officer nodded, realizing that he was losing control of the situation. He turned to leave, casting one last frustrated glance at Jasmine. "You're making a big mistake," he muttered under his breath as he exited the cabin. As the door closed behind him, the cabin erupted in chatter. Passengers exchanged thoughts, many expressing disbelief over what had just transpired. Jasmine felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had stood her ground against a force that sought to silence her, and in doing so, she had ignited a spark of unity among the passengers. "Are you okay?" asked the young man who had spoken up earlier, his concern genuine. "I will be," Jasmine replied, a sense of gratitude swelling within her. "Thank you for speaking out." The flight attendant returned to her side, offering a reassuring smile. "We're going to handle this, Senator. Just stay calm. We'll make sure this doesn't escalate further." Jasmine nodded, feeling the weight of her identity as a senator. She was a voice for those who were often unheard, and she would not let fear dictate her actions. The flight continued, but the air was thick with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, setting the stage for what would come next. With her heart still racing, Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning. The confrontation had unveiled deeper issues that resonated beyond the confines of the airplane, issues that would demand attention, advocacy, and ultimately change. The cabin was alive with murmurs and whispers, as the reality of what had just transpired began to settle over the passengers. Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. The tension still lingered in the air, a heavy fog of uncertainty and fear. She sat back down in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts about what had just happened. The flight attendants worked diligently to calm the passengers, offering reassuring words and refilling drinks. They moved quickly down the aisle, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. But for Jasmine, the normalcy of her routine flight had been shattered, and the specter of injustice loomed large. A few minutes passed, and the cabin door opened again. Officer Daniels re-entered, this time accompanied by the captain. The captain, a seasoned woman with a stern demeanor, took control of the situation as she walked toward the front of the cabin, glancing around to gauge the atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "We appreciate your patience as we resolve this matter. Officer Daniels and I will address the situation now." Jasmine felt her heart pound as she prepared herself for what was to come. She knew that the officer's earlier actions could not go unchallenged. The captain approached Jasmine directly, her expression serious yet empathetic. "Senator, I understand this has been a distressing experience for you," the captain said. "We are committed to ensuring that all passengers are treated fairly and with respect. Please, can you tell me what happened?" Jasmine took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "The officer accused me of being a suspect without any evidence or explanation. He didn't even give me a chance to understand the situation. All I wanted was to travel peacefully to my destination." The captain nodded, absorbing Jasmine's words. "Thank you for your candor. I will be speaking with Officer Daniels to get to the bottom of this. In the meantime, I want you to feel safe and secure on this flight." As the captain stepped away to discuss the matter with Officer Daniels, Jasmine felt the eyes of the passengers upon her. Some offered supportive nods, while others looked on with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. This was about more than just her personal experience. It was about standing up against systemic injustice. The tension in the cabin heightened as the captain and the officer engaged in a hushed conversation. Jasmine strained to hear snippets of their discussion, her heart racing with anticipation. She couldn't shake the feeling that this moment could ripple beyond the confines of the airplane, sparking conversations about race, authority, and justice. Officer Daniels, the captain's voice rose slightly, drawing Jasmine's attention. "This is not how we handle situations on this flight. We need to ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity. I need you to provide evidence for your actions or step back." The passengers murmured in agreement. Emboldened by the captain's stance, Jasmine felt a surge of hope as she recognized that this was a turning point. The captain was advocating for fairness and equality, a reminder that authority could be wielded for justice, not oppression. "Captain, I assure you I was just following protocol," Officer Daniels retorted, his defensiveness apparent. "She matches the description of someone we're looking for." "What description?" the captain pressed, her tone firm. "You need to be transparent about your actions. This is a commercial flight, not a battlefield. You are not above the law." The officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the passengers who were now openly questioning his authority. "I can't disclose that information right now," he finally admitted, his bravado crumbling under the scrutiny. Jasmine seized the moment, her voice strong and unwavering. "If you can't provide evidence for your actions, then you need to let me go. You have no right to detain me without cause." The atmosphere in the cabin crackled with energy as passengers murmured in agreement. They were witnessing a confrontation that extended beyond one woman's experience. It was a collective assertion of dignity and rights. The solidarity among the passengers grew, creating a powerful dynamic that made it clear they were not willing to sit in silence. As the captain turned to face the passengers, she spoke with conviction. "We must hold each other accountable, especially in moments like this. Everyone deserves respect, and as your captain, I will ensure that we uphold those values on this flight." Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude for the captain's support. It was a rare and powerful moment, a testament to the strength of standing together against injustice. The unity among the passengers transformed the situation, shifting the power dynamic in favor of truth and fairness. As the captain returned her focus to Officer Daniels, she reiterated, "You need to reconsider your approach. This is not how we operate. I expect you to respect the senator's rights as a passenger and to conduct yourself appropriately." Jasmine could see the doubt creeping into Officer Daniels' expression. The realization that he was outnumbered, both in the cabin and in his reasoning, began to dawn on him. He took a deep breath, appearing to contemplate his next move, as the murmurs among the passengers continued to rise. In that moment, Jasmine recognized the significance of her role. She was no longer just a senator, she was a voice for the voiceless, a representative for those who had endured similar injustices. She resolved to use this experience to advocate for change not just for herself but for everyone who had faced discrimination and oppression. As the cabin buzzed with anticipation, the situation hung in the balance. The journey had transformed from a simple flight into a powerful dialogue about race, authority, and the fight for justice. With every passing moment, Jasmine felt the weight of her purpose, knowing that this was a defining moment not just for her, but for everyone on board. As the tension hung thick in the air, Jasmine could feel the collective gaze of her fellow passengers weighing on her. It was as if their eyes were each a small flame, igniting a flicker of courage within her. The plane's interior was a mix of muted colors, but the energy was anything but subdued. Each person was holding their breath, uncertain about how the situation would unfold. Jasmine's mind raced with thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger narrative, one that unfolded daily across the country, impacting countless lives. Her experience was a reminder that the fight against racial profiling was ongoing, and she was now thrust into the spotlight, whether she liked it or not. Seated a few rows behind her, Marcus, a middle-aged black man, shifted in his seat, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had witnessed the moment the officer stormed down the aisle, the authoritative demeanor seemingly emboldened by bias rather than justice. Marcus had spent years fighting against the very injustices that Jasmine now faced, advocating for equality in his community. He felt an urge to stand up, to say something, but he hesitated. The fear of repercussions lingered in his mind. "Did you see that?" he whispered to a woman sitting next to him, who nodded in response. "I can't believe this is happening." The woman, who appeared to be in her late 20s, looked equally incredulous. "It's ridiculous. She didn't do anything wrong. Why is he treating her like this?" The murmurs began to spread like wildfire through the cabin. People exchanged glances, nodding in agreement and shaking their heads in disbelief. Some pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the unfolding drama, knowing that documentation could be crucial if the situation escalated further. In the front of the cabin, Jasmine continued to maintain her composure, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and resolve. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of other passengers. There was a solidarity in their expressions, a shared understanding that this moment could be pivotal. They were all witnesses to an injustice, and together, they could challenge the narrative that had been forced upon her. Officer Daniels stood with a stony expression, caught in the crossfire between his authority and the growing discontent of the passengers. The captain's authoritative stance had shifted the atmosphere, and he could feel the pressure mounting. It was no longer just about Jasmine, it was about every person who had faced similar discrimination. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the back of the plane, a woman in her 40s with fierce determination in her eyes. "This is unacceptable. How dare you treat a senator this way? We all saw how you barged in here without cause." The cabin erupted into murmurs of agreement, the passengers rallying together as they voiced their outrage. Jasmine felt a rush of gratitude towards the woman. Her courage ignited a fire within Jasmine that she didn't know she possessed. It was as if the collective voice of the passengers had transformed into a shield, protecting her from the onslaught of hostility. "Exactly," shouted another passenger, a young man with tattoos covering his arms. "This is not the way to handle things. We're on a flight, not in some cop drama." Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his bravado wavering. The realization that he was facing not just Jasmine but a unified group of passengers began to dawn on him. He had expected compliance and submission. Instead, he was met with resistance and defiance. "Let's keep this civil, please," he said, attempting to regain control. But his voice lacked the authority it once had, faltering against the overwhelming dissent. Jasmine seized the moment, her voice rising above the crowd. "This is not just about me. This is about every individual who has been targeted and marginalized because of their race. It's time we hold those in power accountable for their actions." The cabin erupted once more, cheers and claps echoing through the narrow aisle. People were standing in solidarity, their expressions a mix of anger and support. It was a beautiful display of unity, a collective push against the injustice that Jasmine had faced. In that moment, Jasmine felt empowered. The fears that had initially gripped her began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose. She was not alone, she was part of something much larger than herself. She was representing all those who had endured similar experiences, and she would not back down. Officer Daniels looked around, realizing that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. The power he once wielded seemed to slip away as the weight of the passenger's gaze pressed against him. "Listen, I didn't mean," he started, but Jasmine interrupted him, her tone resolute. "No more excuses. You've already made your choice, and it's time to own it." The captain, witnessing the overwhelming support for Jasmine, stepped back into the spotlight. "I will not allow this flight to be marred by prejudice. I expect an explanation for your actions, Officer Daniels. You must de-escalate this situation immediately." With the captain's words, the cabin fell silent, all eyes turning to Officer Daniels as he grappled with the implications of his actions. He was faced with a choice to double down on his previous behavior or to recognize the gravity of the moment. Jasmine held her breath, awaiting the outcome. It was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for everyone who had gathered in that confined space. Would they emerge from this flight with a renewed sense of justice, or would the shadows of prejudice continue to loom? As the tension mounted, one thing was clear: this moment would be etched into the minds of everyone on that plane. A reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right. The atmosphere in the airplane cabin was charged, filled with the tension of a standoff. Jasmine took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet she refused to let fear dictate her response. She had faced adversity before, and had learned to stand tall in the face of injustice. "Listen," Officer Daniels said, attempting to regain his composure. "I received a report about a suspicious individual on this flight. I was just doing my job." The passengers erupted with indignation. "Suspicious? She's done nothing wrong," shouted Marcus, the man who had first reacted to the incident. His voice rang with urgency and anger. "You can't just target someone based on their appearance." "Exactly," chimed in the woman from earlier, her voice rising with passion. "We all saw how you barged in here. You didn't even bother to investigate." Jasmine felt a wave of support wash over her. It was an empowering reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. The chorus of voices from the other passengers was like a shield, surrounding her with solidarity. "I'm just following orders," Officer Daniels stammered, his bravado wavering. "There was a misunderstanding, and I thought..." Jasmine interjected, her voice steady yet firm. "You thought what? That I looked suspicious because I'm a black woman in a suit? That is not an acceptable excuse. Your actions were unfounded and unjustified." The cabin was now an arena of collective defiance. The passengers leaned forward, eager to witness the unfolding confrontation. The weight of Jasmine's words resonated deeply within them. They were not just spectators, they were witnesses to a crucial moment of accountability. As the tension mounted, Jasmine maintained her composure, drawing on her own experiences of facing prejudice. She had encountered bias in various forms throughout her life, but this felt different. She was not just a victim, she was a representative of all those who had endured similar treatment. She refused to be silenced. Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. The growing scrutiny from the passengers was undeniable. "I didn't know who you were," he finally admitted, his voice faltering. "I just reacted." "Your reaction was based on prejudice," Jasmine shot back. "If you had taken a moment to actually assess the situation instead of jumping to conclusions, we wouldn't be here right now." The silence that followed was deafening. The passengers exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. Jasmine's words had struck a chord. They all understood that this incident was more than a personal affront to Jasmine. It was a glaring reflection of systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, a young woman seated near the front. "What about the person who made the report? Shouldn't they be held accountable too?" The question hung in the air, prompting nods of agreement from other passengers. They were keenly aware that the issue at hand extended beyond Jasmine and Officer Daniels. It was about the culture of fear and suspicion that perpetuated racial profiling. Officer Daniels took a step back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I'll report it," he stammered, his authority slipping further away. "I'll report that I was wrong." "Wrong doesn't cut it," Marcus shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. "You need to understand that this isn't just a mistake. This is about lives and dignity. You can't just walk away from this." Jasmine looked at Officer Daniels, searching for a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You have an opportunity to change," she said, her voice softer yet firm. "Acknowledge your mistake and commit to doing better. It's never too late to learn." For the first time, Daniels appeared to truly consider her words. His shoulders slumped slightly as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. It was a turning point not just for him, but for the passengers who had stood up against injustice. As the captain made his way back down the aisle, he paused to survey the scene. He locked eyes with Jasmine, and she could see a flicker of respect in his gaze. "We need to take this matter seriously," he said, addressing both the passengers and Officer Daniels. "This isn't just about maintaining order, it's about justice." Jasmine nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge within her. This was a moment to seize. "Let's make sure that our voices are heard," she said, rallying the passengers. "We need to report this incident and ensure that it never happens again." The cabin erupted into applause and cheers, the passengers invigorated by Jasmine's determination. They were no longer passive observers, they were a united front ready to challenge the status quo. In that moment, the airplane transformed into a symbol of resilience. They were flying through the skies, but it felt as if they were soaring toward a greater purpose, a commitment to justice, equality, and accountability. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they were ready to face it together. As the atmosphere inside the plane crackled with indignation, Officer Daniels struggled to regain control of the situation. The growing tension was palpable, each second feeling like an eternity. The passengers were no longer passive observers, they were a collective force, united against the injustice unfolding before them. Jasmine stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She could sense the rising frustration among the passengers, their voices a steady crescendo of anger and disbelief. "This isn't just about me," she asserted, her voice steady and resolute. "This is about all of us. This is about dismantling the prejudices that exist in our society." The officer's face flushed red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. He shifted his weight, desperately trying to assert his authority in a situation spiraling out of his control. "I'm trained to deal with potential threats," he barked, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus, still seated a few rows behind Jasmine, leaned forward. "What kind of threat do you think a black woman in a suit poses? You're not fooling anyone with this act. You've just exposed your own biases." The passengers murmured in agreement, their voices intertwining into a powerful chorus. Some had even begun to record the incident on their phones, capturing the reality of the moment for posterity. The officer glanced nervously around, aware that every eye in the cabin was fixed on him, judging his actions. "Please, everyone," Officer Daniels attempted to appeal to the crowd, but his plea fell flat against the mounting discontent. "Let's not escalate this further. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Jasmine echoed, incredulous. "You think it's your job to humiliate someone without justification? That's not policing, that's profiling." With each word, the energy in the cabin shifted. The tension thickened like fog, and it became evident that the passengers were unwilling to back down. The sense of solidarity among them was invigorating, transforming what could have been a moment of fear into one of empowerment. Jasmine felt the strength of their support as she faced Officer Daniels. "If you truly believe in your role as a protector, then you should be protecting the rights and dignity of every person on this plane, regardless of their skin color." Daniels clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You don't understand what it's like to be in my position. I have to make split-second decisions based on the information I receive." "And that's exactly the problem," Jasmine shot back. "You're making decisions based on assumptions instead of facts. Your training should prepare you to see beyond skin color and recognize the person in front of you." The cabin grew quieter, the passengers hanging on every word. The weight of Jasmine's argument struck a chord, pushing them to reconsider the systemic issues at play. They were witnessing a moment that transcended their flight. It was a reflection of a broader societal challenge. "Officer, why don't you check the identification she just showed you?" a passenger suggested, her voice steady. "If you were truly concerned about security, you would verify rather than jump to conclusions." The officer hesitated, glancing at Jasmine's ID, which lay discarded on the floor between them. His pride fought against the reality of his actions. He didn't want to admit that he had acted rashly, but the mounting pressure was hard to ignore. "Fine," he muttered, reluctantly bending down to pick up the ID. As he read the information, his expression shifted from anger to shock. "Wait, you're a senator." "Yes," Jasmine replied, her voice unwavering. "And you've just made a terrible mistake." The realization hit Officer Daniels like a freight train. The passengers, once filled with righteous anger, now watched with bated breath, eager to see how he would respond. Would he back down, or would he double down on his misguided beliefs? I didn't know," he stammered, his earlier bravado crumbling. The air was thick with disbelief. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and vindication. "Now you do," Jasmine said, her tone firm yet calm. "And I expect an apology not just to me but to everyone on this flight who has witnessed your unwarranted aggression." As Officer Daniels processed the reality of his actions, the atmosphere shifted once again. The tension that had hung over the cabin began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of collective purpose. The passengers were no longer spectators to a spectacle of injustice. They had become a part of something larger. "Let's use this moment to spark a change," Marcus spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence. "This isn't just about one officer's mistake. It's about holding each other accountable and ensuring that we all do better." The cabin erupted into murmurs of agreement. There was a newfound energy, a sense of hope ignited by the confrontation. Jasmine's stance against the officer's racism had transformed the situation from one of fear to one of empowerment. As the plane soared through the skies, the passengers began to discuss what they could do next. They understood that this moment would not only impact them but could also ripple out to others beyond the confines of the aircraft. Jasmine stood tall, feeling a sense of solidarity with her fellow passengers. They were no longer just strangers on a flight, they were allies in the fight against prejudice, ready to confront injustice in whatever form it appeared. As the aircraft continued its journey, the battle against ignorance and bias became a shared mission. It was a reminder that even in the most unexpected circumstances, the power of unity could bring about change. The moment hung in the air, charged with a mix of disbelief and anticipation. Officer Daniels stood frozen, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. As he processed Jasmine's identity as a senator, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tension to a collective determination for justice. Jasmine maintained her composure, feeling a surge of empowerment wash over her. "You think this is just about me? This is about every person who has been subjected to racial profiling and discrimination," she stated firmly, her voice resonating through the aircraft. The other passengers nodded in agreement, rallying behind her words. A woman in the front row spoke up, her voice trembling yet strong. "You're right. This happens too often. It's time we stand up against it." Officer Daniels, still grappling with his realization, looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of those who had witnessed his wrongful behavior. For the first time, he began to feel the weight of accountability on his shoulders. I didn't mean to offend anyone," he stammered, his bravado diminished. Jasmine's expression softened slightly, recognizing the moment of vulnerability. "It's not just about offense, officer. It's about the systemic issues that lead to situations like this. You need to understand that your actions carry consequences." The passengers listened intently, each absorbing the gravity of her message. Marcus, from a few rows back, raised his voice. "We're all human here. No one should be treated differently based on the color of their skin. It's time for change." The cabin buzzed with agreement. A united front against the prejudices that had long persisted in society. Jasmine glanced at her fellow passengers, feeling a sense of camaraderie among them. They were no longer just individuals on a flight, they were a collective force advocating for justice. "Officer, you need to recognize that your actions stem from a deeper issue," Jasmine continued. "Racism isn't just a personal failing, it's a systemic problem that permeates law enforcement and society at large. Acknowledging that is the first step toward change." The officer shifted uncomfortably, grappling with her words. "I get that," he replied slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But how do I change? I was just following orders." "And that's part of the problem," Jasmine replied, her tone assertive. "It's crucial to question those orders and the systems that enforce them. You have the power to be part of the solution." Just then, the flight attendant approached, her eyes wide with concern. "What's happening here?" she asked. Taking in the scene, the passengers united in their support for Jasmine and the visibly shaken officer. "We're having a discussion about racial profiling," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. "This officer attempted to arrest me without any justification, and we're addressing the systemic issues behind his actions." The flight attendant nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll alert the captain," she said, glancing at the officer. "This needs to be reported." As she walked away, the tension in the cabin remained, but it was now infused with a sense of purpose. Jasmine's voice rose above the murmurs, echoing the resolve of her fellow passengers. "Let's not forget that our voices matter. We have the power to change the narrative surrounding these issues. If we don't speak up, who will?" The passengers erupted into applause, their support unwavering. Officer Daniels felt the heat of their collective gaze, but it was different now. He wasn't being attacked, he was being challenged to do better, to recognize the harm that had been done. "Senator," he began, the words catching in his throat. "I apologize. I realize now that I've made a mistake. I didn't take the time to understand who you were or the implications of my actions. Jasmine nodded, accepting his acknowledgement but making it clear that it was only the beginning. Apologies are only meaningful when accompanied by action. You have the opportunity to advocate for change, to ensure that this doesn't happen again. The officer looked at her, sincerity in his eyes. I will. I'll work to educate myself and my colleagues about these issues. This isn't just a lesson for me, it's a lesson for everyone in law enforcement. As the flight continued, the atmosphere shifted from one of confrontation to one of collaboration. Passengers shared their own stories of injustice, creating a dialogue that was both healing and empowering. Jasmine listened intently, her heart swelling with pride for those who found the courage to speak out. In that moment, they were united not just as passengers on a plane, but as advocates for a brighter future. Together, they were standing against the tides of ignorance, ready to confront the challenges ahead. As they approached Washington, D.C., the plane began its descent. Jasmine glanced around at the faces surrounding her, each one a testament to resilience and strength. She knew that their journey was just beginning, they were all part of something greater than themselves. With renewed hope, Jasmine took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The fight for justice was far from over, but in that moment she felt a sense of unity that would propel them forward. As the plane glided toward the runway, the mood shifted dramatically. What had begun as a confrontation had morphed into an unexpected moment of collective reflection. Officer Daniels, still grappling with the magnitude of his actions, felt a mixture of shame and determination. He couldn't help but listen intently to the conversations around him, absorbing the stories of passengers who had faced discrimination and profiling. In the row behind him, a young woman shared her experience of being pulled over for a minor traffic violation, only to be treated as a criminal. I was scared, she recounted, her voice shaking. All I could think about was how quickly things could escalate. It was just a broken taillight, but I felt like my life was on the line. Daniels shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of her words. He thought about how often he had taken the power of his badge for granted, using it without considering the implications of his authority. The stories from the passengers painted a stark picture of the fear that many lived with daily. Jasmine turned to him, her expression a blend of empathy and resolve. You see, officer, it's not just about one incident. It's about a systemic issue that affects countless lives. People shouldn't have to live in fear of being treated unfairly because of their race. He nodded, the reality of her words settling deep within him. I get it now. I thought I was doing my job, but I see how my actions can perpetuate this cycle of fear. The plane touched down and the cabin erupted in applause, but for Officer Daniels, the clapping faded into the background. He was consumed by a need to change, not just for himself, but for everyone affected by the biases that had become ingrained in society. As the passengers began to disembark, Jasmine stood up, straightening her suit. I appreciate your willingness to listen, officer. Change starts with acknowledging our mistakes. I hope you take this opportunity seriously. He looked up at her, feeling a sense of gratitude mixed with regret. I will. This is a turning point for me. The cabin emptied, and soon only a few passengers remained. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, collecting trash and ensuring that everything was in order for the next group of travelers. Daniels took a deep breath, preparing himself to face the fallout from this incident. Once they reached the terminal, Jasmine led the way, flanked by a few passengers who had joined her in solidarity. Let's get to the press conference, she said, her voice steady and assertive. I want to ensure that this incident is addressed publicly. Daniels hesitated, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. You're going to the media. Absolutely, Jasmine replied, glancing back at him. This is bigger than just us. We need to raise awareness and advocate for change. We need to ensure that people understand the impact of racial profiling. As they walked through the airport, Jasmine continued to engage with the small group of supporters surrounding her. They shared thoughts and strategies about how to effectively communicate their message to the public. Daniels followed closely behind, absorbing the energy and determination of the group. Reaching the press area, Jasmine stepped up to the podium, flanked by the supportive passengers. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Thank you all for being here today. I want to address an incident that took place on our flight. I was wrongfully detained by an officer who made assumptions based solely on the color of my skin. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Cameras clicked, and reporters leaned in, eager to hear her message. This is not just about me. This is about a systemic problem that continues to affect countless individuals across this nation. We need to have conversations about racial profiling and hold those in power accountable for their actions. As she spoke, Daniels felt a swell of emotions. He stood at the back of the room, a silent witness to Jasmine's courage. This was a moment of truth, not just for her, but for him as well. Jasmine continued, "I urge everyone to reflect on their biases and to advocate for change in their communities. We must do better. We must be better." When she finished, the crowd erupted into applause, and Daniels felt a surge of admiration for her bravery. He realized that he had a responsibility too. The moment had come for him to step forward. Gathering his courage, he approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. "Excuse me," he said, clearing his throat as the crowd turned to look at him. "I'm Officer Daniels. I'm the one who wrongfully detained Senator Jasmine. I want to publicly apologize for my actions." The room fell silent, the weight of his admission hanging in the air. "I recognize that I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I've learned a painful lesson today. I'm committed to doing better, not just for myself, but for the communities I serve." Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise, but then softened with understanding. She stepped back slightly, allowing him to speak his truth. "This is a turning point for me," he continued, addressing both the reporters and the public. "I pledge to educate myself and work with my department to address issues of racial profiling and discrimination. We need to foster trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval. Daniels could feel the weight of their collective scrutiny, but also a sense of hope. As he stepped down from the podium, Jasmine approached him, extending her hand. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Daniels. It takes a lot to admit when we're wrong." He grasped her hand firmly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you for being a voice for so many. I won't let this opportunity for change slip away." The two stood together, a symbol of unlikely allies in a fight against injustice. Together, they had sparked a conversation that needed to happen, and as they faced the cameras, they knew that their journey was just beginning. In the days following the incident on the plane, news of Officer Daniels' public apology spread like wildfire. Headlines dominated social media feeds and news broadcasts, sparking debates about racism, police conduct, and the responsibility of law enforcement. Senator Jasmine's bold stand against racial profiling resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring a wave of support and discussion. Within hours of the press conference, various civil rights organizations reached out to Jasmine, expressing their desire to collaborate on initiatives aimed at combating racial injustice. She found herself inundated with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and community forums. It was a whirlwind of activity, but Jasmine embraced the opportunity to amplify her message. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels faced a different kind of scrutiny. His department initiated an internal review of the incident, which placed him under the microscope. Colleagues and superiors had mixed reactions. Some praised his willingness to admit his mistakes publicly, while others questioned his judgment and the potential repercussions for the department's reputation. Feeling the pressure, Daniels sat in his small office, reflecting on his career and the choices that led him to this moment. He recalled the countless times he had pulled over individuals based on instinct rather than evidence, how he had allowed biases to dictate his actions. It was a painful realization, and he knew he had a long road ahead to rebuild trust within his community. In a meeting with his commanding officer, Daniels felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. "You've opened a can of worms here," Daniels' supervisor said, crossing his arms. "This isn't just about you anymore, it's about the department and our relationship with the community. We need to handle this carefully." "I understand, Sir," Daniels replied, his voice steady but tinged with apprehension. "I'm willing to face the consequences. I want to be part of the solution." "Good," his officer said, leaning back in his chair. "You'll need to participate in community outreach programs. We'll also set up sensitivity training for all officers. You'll lead those sessions." Lee Daniels felt a wave of unease wash over him. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for that." "You are now," his supervisor said firmly. "You've had a first-hand experience that many others haven't. Use it to educate your fellow officers. Change begins with those who are willing to acknowledge their flaws." Daniels nodded, understanding the gravity of the task ahead. As the meeting concluded, he left with a sense of purpose mingled with trepidation. He knew that talking about race and policing would be uncomfortable, but it was a necessary step toward healing. Meanwhile, Jasmine was busy crafting legislation aimed at reforming police practices. She gathered a diverse coalition of lawmakers and community leaders, determined to create a bill that addressed systemic racism within law enforcement. In her office, she worked late into the night, poring over reports, statistics, and personal accounts of those affected by racial profiling. One evening, while discussing the proposed legislation with her team, she looked around the room, feeling a sense of camaraderie. This isn't just about changing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds, she emphasized. We need to create a culture of accountability within police departments across the country. Her team nodded in agreement, fueled by the urgency of their mission. They brainstormed ideas on how to effectively communicate the importance of their work to the public, knowing that change wouldn't happen overnight. As Jasmine continued her efforts, Officer Daniels immersed himself in community outreach programs, attending meetings and speaking to groups about the importance of transparency and accountability. During one session, he shared his story and the lessons he had learned, listening intently to the experiences of others. I used to think I was above it all, he admitted to a small group gathered in a community center. But I've come to realize that biases are ingrained in all of us, and we need to confront them head on. It's not easy, but it's essential. The conversations were raw and revealing. Some community members expressed their frustration and anger, while others offered words of encouragement. Slowly, a dialogue began to form, one that challenged stereotypes and sought understanding. As weeks turned into months, the ripple effect of that fateful flight continued to unfold. Jasmine's legislation gained traction, garnering support from a diverse coalition of lawmakers, community activists, and citizens who had felt the sting of injustice. Daniels, too, found himself embraced by members of the community, who recognized his genuine efforts to change. But not everyone was pleased with the shift in dynamics. Some officers in the department felt betrayed by Daniels' actions, believing he had undermined their authority. They viewed him as a liability, a symbol of weakness in a profession that thrived on strength. Whispered conversations in the break room and tense exchanges in the locker room hinted at the growing divide. Despite the challenges, Daniels remained steadfast in his commitment to change. He knew that to be an effective leader, he needed to embody the principles he preached. He sought mentorship from community leaders, continuing to learn and grow, determined to be a force for good. On a particularly cold morning, Jasmine received news that her bill had passed in the House. As she stood before the cameras, flanked by supporters, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. "This is a monumental step toward justice," she declared, her voice strong and unwavering. "But it's only the beginning. We must remain vigilant and ensure that this legislation is enforced. Change doesn't happen without our continued effort." Daniels watched the broadcast from his home, feeling a surge of hope. He knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them head on. The bond between him and Jasmine, forged in the fires of adversity, had grown stronger. Together, they would work to dismantle the barriers that had long divided their communities. As the sun set on that transformative day, both Jasmine and Daniels knew that the fight for justice was far from over. They were on a path toward healing, armed with the lessons of the past and a shared vision for a more equitable future. Chapter 10: A New Beginning. Months had passed since the fateful incident on the airplane, and a sense of change was palpable in the air. The momentum surrounding Senator Jasmine's legislation had transformed into a nationwide movement, igniting discussions about racial injustice and police reform across the country. Jasmine had become a symbol of hope and resilience, her voice resonating with countless individuals who had faced similar injustices. In her office, Jasmine was busy preparing for an upcoming town hall meeting. The event would serve as a platform for community members to voice their concerns, share their experiences, and engage in constructive dialogue. She knew that the success of her legislation hinged not only on its passage but also on the community's willingness to embrace change. As she reviewed her notes, her mind wandered to Officer Daniels. He had continued to work tirelessly in the community, attending meetings and collaborating with local organizations. They had formed an unlikely partnership, united by a shared goal of fostering understanding and healing. Though they had faced criticism from various fronts, their commitment to the cause had only strengthened. On the day of the town hall meeting, the auditorium buzzed with energy. Community members filled the seats, eager to participate in discussions about policing, safety, and the path forward. Jasmine arrived early, greeting familiar faces and encouraging newcomers to share their thoughts. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a mix of hope and apprehension. As the meeting commenced, Jasmine took the stage, her heart racing with excitement. "Thank you all for being here today. This is a safe space for all voices to be heard," she began, her tone warm and inviting. "Today we'll discuss how we can work together to create a safer and more equitable community for everyone." The room erupted in applause, a testament to the collective desire for change. Jasmine introduced Officer Daniels, who had agreed to share his journey and insights with the audience. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent, all eyes on him. "Thank you, Senator, and thank you to everyone for allowing me to speak today," Daniels started, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I want to begin by acknowledging the pain and anger many of you have experienced at the hands of law enforcement. I was once part of a system that perpetuated those injustices, and for that, I am truly sorry." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others remained skeptical. Daniels pressed on, determined to foster understanding. "I've learned that acknowledging our biases and mistakes is the first step toward healing. I am committed to being a part of that change, and I hope to rebuild the trust that has been lost." As he shared his experiences and the lessons he had learned, the audience listened intently. Some participants began to share their stories, recounting instances of racial profiling and fear they had faced. Emotions ran high, and the atmosphere shifted from one of tension to vulnerability. The room was filled with a sense of solidarity as individuals opened up about their struggles and hopes for a better future. A young woman stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I've lost family members to police violence. How can I trust that things will change?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniels met her gaze, his heart aching for her pain. "I understand your skepticism, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I am here to listen, to learn, and to fight alongside you for change. Your experiences matter, and they will shape the way we move forward." The young woman nodded, her expression softening slightly. The room filled with a mix of emotions: anger, sorrow, hope as stories continued to unfold. Jasmine encouraged open dialogue, creating space for healing. As the evening progressed, the conversation expanded beyond personal anecdotes to discussions about specific changes needed in policing practices. Ideas flowed freely, and participants began to collaborate on community initiatives aimed at promoting accountability and transparency in law enforcement. By the time the meeting concluded, there was a palpable sense of connection in the room. Jasmine and Daniel stood together, witnessing the transformative power of dialogue and community engagement. They exchanged a knowing glance, understanding that they were just beginning to scratch the surface of what needed to be done. In the days that followed, the energy from the town hall meeting sparked further initiatives. Community members organized neighborhood watch programs, engaged in discussions with local police departments, and developed workshops focused on building relationships between law enforcement and the community. Jasmine continued to work on her legislation, incorporating feedback from constituents and refining her proposals to ensure they reflected the needs of the people she served. She remained steadfast in her mission to create a more just society, drawing strength from the stories and experiences shared during the town hall meeting. Meanwhile, Daniels faced the ongoing challenges of being a police officer in a reformed system. He actively participated in training sessions, emphasizing the importance of empathy and understanding in law enforcement. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was committed to being part of that change. As the weeks turned into months, both Jasmine and Daniels realized that their partnership was evolving. They had forged a bond rooted in mutual respect and understanding, united by a shared purpose. They began planning community outreach events together, aiming to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. One evening, as they sat in a local cafe discussing upcoming events, Daniels turned to Jasmine with a smile. "You know, I never thought I'd be sitting here with someone like you, working toward a common goal. It's inspiring." Jasmine laughed softly, her eyes sparkling. "I think it's proof that change is possible when we're willing to listen and learn from each other." Their conversation flowed easily, a blend of laughter and serious discussion about the future. They shared their hopes and fears, understanding that their paths had intertwined in ways neither had anticipated. As they parted ways that night, both felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer just a senator and a police officer. They were advocates for change, champions of justice, and allies in a fight for a better future. Together, they would continue to work tirelessly to dismantle the barriers that had long divided their communities, forging a new beginning built on understanding, empathy, and hope. As the momentum of their initiatives grew, so did the attention from the media and the public. Senator Jasmine's bold stance on police reform had put her in the national spotlight, making her a target for both praise and criticism. While many lauded her efforts, others questioned her motives and commitment to law enforcement, branding her a traitor to her own community. In the weeks following the town hall meeting, Jasmine found herself bombarded with phone calls, emails, and social media messages. Some were filled with encouragement and support, while others contained venomous attacks. She had anticipated some backlash, but the intensity of the negativity was overwhelming. It was hard not to feel the weight of expectations from her constituents and the pressure of representing a community yearning for change. One evening, as Jasmine prepared for another public forum, She glanced at her phone and noticed a message that stood out. It was from her childhood friend Malik, who had once been a passionate activist. He had been vocal about his disapproval of Jasmine's collaboration with Officer Daniels and had expressed concern that she was losing touch with the community she represented. Curious yet apprehensive, she opened the message. "Jasmine, we need to talk. I appreciate your efforts, but it feels like you're losing sight of what we're fighting for. Don't forget where you came from." Jasmine sighed, feeling a mixture of frustration and sadness. She understood Malik's perspective, but she also believed in the importance of working with those willing to change. It was a delicate balance, and she feared that those who supported her vision would be overshadowed by the growing dissent. Later that week, during a press conference, Jasmine stood before a crowd of reporters, determined to address the concerns head-on. The atmosphere was tense, and cameras flashed as she took the podium. She knew this was an opportunity to clarify her stance and reaffirm her commitment to the community. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "I want to address the recent criticisms regarding my collaboration with law enforcement. I understand the skepticism and pain many of you feel. Trust has been broken, and I'm here to acknowledge that." She glanced around at the faces in the audience, seeing a mix of supporters and detractors. "I believe that meaningful change cannot happen in isolation. We need to engage with those who have the power to make a difference, including law enforcement. It's about holding them accountable and ensuring they understand the impact of their actions." Jasmine's words resonated with some in the crowd, but she could sense the resistance from others. A reporter raised his hand, challenging her. "But isn't partnering with the police just reinforcing the system that oppresses your community? How can you trust them after what happened?" Jasmine paused, taking a deep breath. "It's true that many have faced injustices at the hands of law enforcement, including myself. But if we only continue to stand apart, we'll never be able to build the bridges necessary for true reform. Officer Daniels has shown a willingness to change, and I believe it's our responsibility to foster that change." The tension in the room thickened as murmurs spread among the audience. Jasmine felt the weight of their skepticism but stood firm in her conviction. "I am here to fight for our rights, for justice, and for a system that serves everyone equitably. I cannot do that alone, and neither can law enforcement. We need to work together to dismantle the prejudices that have long divided us." As she finished her statement, she could see a glimmer of understanding in some faces while others remained skeptical. The press conference ended with more questions than answers, and Jasmine left feeling drained yet resolute. In the days that followed, the backlash continued. Protests erupted, both in support of Jasmine and against her collaboration with police. Some community members organized rallies to voice their discontent, holding signs that read "No trust, no peace and justice for our people." Amidst the turmoil, Jasmine received a call from Officer Daniels. "Hey Jasmine, I've been following the protests and the media coverage. I know it's tough right now," he said, his voice laced with concern. "Yeah, it feels like I'm caught in the crossfire," she replied, her voice weary. "I want to fight for change, but it feels like I'm losing the trust of my community." Daniels understood her frustration. "I get it. It's a challenging position, but remember why you started this journey. You're a voice for those who've been silenced for too long. Let's continue to engage with the community and show them that we're committed to real change." Jasmine appreciated his encouragement but felt a nagging doubt. "I just hope they see my intentions. I don't want to betray the people I care about." Daniels paused before responding. "You're not betraying anyone. Change is uncomfortable, and it often takes time for people to see the bigger picture. Just keep being open and honest with them, and they'll come around." As the weeks went by, Jasmine and Daniels worked tirelessly to organize community forums, inviting residents to share their experiences and engage in constructive dialogue. They created safe spaces for open discussions, allowing individuals to express their concerns and frustrations. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere began to shift. While some continued to voice their doubts, others started to recognize the efforts being made to bridge the gap between the community and law enforcement. Jasmine felt a renewed sense of hope as she watched the conversations unfold. People were coming together to share their stories, bridging divides that had long seemed insurmountable. Although the road ahead was fraught with challenges, she believed they were laying the groundwork for a more just future. Despite the hurdles, Jasmine remained resolute in her mission, committed to standing up for those who had been silenced for far too long. She knew that healing would take time, but together with Daniels and the community, they were beginning to forge a path toward a brighter tomorrow. As the weeks progressed, the atmosphere in the community began to shift. What once felt like a tense standoff between the senator and her constituents slowly transformed into a collaborative effort to address the deep-seated issues that plagued their city. The town hall meetings and community forums initiated by Senator Jasmine were gaining traction, attracting not only concerned citizens but also local leaders and activists eager to contribute. The next forum was scheduled at the community center, a familiar place where residents gathered for various events. As Jasmine arrived, she could feel the buzz of anticipation in the air. Colorful banners hung around the room, proclaiming messages of unity and hope. She was greeted by friendly faces, neighbors, friends, and even some skeptics who had come to see what all the fuss was about. Jasmine took a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that it would be crucial to not only share her vision but also to listen to the voices that had felt unheard for too long. As she surveyed the audience, she noticed Malik sitting in the front row, arms crossed and an intense look on his face. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I know there's been a lot of uncertainty and frustration in our community lately, and I want to assure you that I'm here to listen and learn from each of you." The crowd murmured in acknowledgement, some nodding their heads in agreement. Jasmine continued, "Tonight is about building bridges of understanding, compassion, and trust. We need to talk about our experiences, our fears, and our hopes for a better future." She opened the floor to questions, and the atmosphere quickly shifted from one of skepticism to engagement. A woman stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "Senator, how can we trust you when the system has failed us for so long? My brother was wrongly accused and treated like a criminal by the police. How do we know this is not just talk?" Jasmine nodded, understanding the pain behind the question. "I hear you. The system has failed many of us, including myself, but we must fight for change together. I'm not here to offer empty promises. I'm here to advocate for policies that hold law enforcement accountable and ensure that our voices are not just heard, but acted upon." The discussion continued, and various members of the community shared their stories. Each testimony was met with compassion and understanding, creating an atmosphere where people felt comfortable opening up about their experiences. Malik eventually stood up, addressing the room. "Senator, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it feels like a lot of us are still hurting. How can we be sure this isn't just another political game?" Jasmine met his gaze, her expression earnest. "I understand the skepticism, Malik. I truly do. But we need to channel that hurt into action. Let's not only talk about the issues, but also come up with solutions together. This isn't just my fight, it's ours." The crowd responded positively, and soon, ideas began flowing. Residents proposed initiatives for youth programs, community policing efforts, and more robust accountability measures for law enforcement. The room was alive with energy, and Jasmine felt a surge of hope. As the forum wrapped up, Jasmine noticed the change in the atmosphere. What began as a room filled with skepticism had transformed into a collective of people united by a common goal, creating a safer and more equitable community. She felt a sense of accomplishment as she watched her constituents come together, their passion palpable in the air. After the meeting, Malik approached her, a more open expression on his face. "I'm sorry for being harsh earlier. I just want to make sure our voices matter," he admitted. "They do matter," Malik, Jasmine replied, her voice sincere. "Your perspective is vital to this process. I want to continue hearing from you and everyone else in our community. We need your voices now more than ever." In the following days, the discussions from the forum ignited a wave of activism. Community members began organizing additional meetings, and volunteers stepped forward to help implement the proposed initiatives. The local media caught wind of the grassroots movement, highlighting Jasmine's role in facilitating the dialogue and the community's efforts toward change. Jasmine felt a renewed sense of purpose as she saw the community rallying together. Each step forward reinforced her belief that they could indeed create a more just and equitable society. She also understood that this was just the beginning. The challenges ahead were significant, but she was ready to face them. With the support of her community and Officer Daniels by her side, she knew they could navigate the turbulent waters of reform together. As the sun set on a particularly inspiring day, Jasmine sat down to reflect on the journey thus far. She wrote in her journal, "Change is a process, not a destination. Today I witnessed the power of unity, and it gives me hope for a brighter future." With her heart full of optimism, Jasmine prepared for the next steps in their fight for justice, knowing that they were on the cusp of something truly transformative.